So I have my non-linear mug again, which must mean only one thing. It is time for another episode of non-linear books. Today I'm going to be talking about books with dual narratives. By the way, I hope you can still hear me. My voice has decided that it no longer wants anything to do with me and is slowly leaving me, but hopefully I can still just about make myself heard. I normally have quite a loud voice, which is quite useful for filming, but right now I'm sounding slightly croaky. So today is the third episode in a series I've been doing called Non-Linear Books. I think it's been a few months since I did the last one because I've been a bit inconsistent with this series, so you may not have seen them before. When I say non-linear books, I mean books that do not follow a chronological linear plot structure. Books that do slightly weird things with form and structure and tell their story in a kind of unique and unusual different way. So today I'm going to be talking about dual narratives. When I say dual narratives, the books I'm going to be talking about today are all books that are told half in first person and half in third person. So they have like two perspectives going through them and in a way two narratives that kind of bleed into one another. So I have 5 brilliant books to talk to you about today, all of which are partly first person, partly third person narratives. So I'm going to start off by talking about Bleak House by Charles Dickens because it is always good to begin with a Dickens. So like many Dickens novels, it is really hard to give a brief explanation of what Bleak House is about, but at the centre of Bleak House as a novel there is this court case called Jarndyce and Jarndyce. Basically, years and years ago, there was a man called Mr. Jarndyce and he left a substantial fortune behind him, but he also left a lot of wills, and no one can decide quite who all the money should go to. So there is this incredibly long court case that has been spanning generations and generations, and that is kind of the thread that holds a lot of Bleak House together. There are 4 characters who you need to know about for me to explain the structure of the plot. There is a character called Mr. Jarndyce who is an older man in his 50s, and at the beginning of this book he adopts 2 young people who are wards of court. They are also potential beneficiaries from the Jarndyce and Jarndyce case. These 2 young people are Ada Clare and Richard Carstone. And to make it kind of okay for Ada Clare, a young woman, to reside with her distant relation, an older man, and another relation of hers, a young man, Mr. Jarndyce also brings into their home of Bleak House a young woman who is also his ward called Esther Summerson. So half of Bleak House is told from the perspective of this young woman, Esther Summerson, from her first person narrative. And then the other half of the novel is a third person, present tense perspective. We often think of the present tense as quite a modern thing, but Dickens makes quite a lot of use of it in his work and I really enjoy it. And these 2 sections do kind of interweave, so we often have like a few chapters of Esther's narrative, then a few chapters of the third person. Esther is never seen by the third person perspective, apart from once very briefly, but for the most part, although a lot of characters are seen in both perspectives, they don't really cross over and Esther kind of remains in her first person narrative and we don't get this other outside view of her really. There's also been quite a lot of interesting critical work on Bleak House and the idea that Esther's narrative is like the female narrative of the book and the third person narrative is a kind of male narrative of the book. But then there's also this other like school of thought that suggests that what if Esther is actually writing the whole book and she's just giving like a different account of stuff that she didn't see, which I think is really interesting. The majority of Dickens' novels are entirely in third person, with the exception of Great Expectations and David Copperfield, which are both in first person, and also the exception of the first few chapters of The Old Curiosity Shop, which are in first person before it moves into third. And I personally find the structure of Bleak House really interesting. It allows us both to get a kind of cold, stark perspective on the rest of everything going on around Esther, but also to get Esther's perspective, especially because this is a book that is often about like the law. So in a way you can read like the objective third person narrative as a kind of like lawyer's account of what's going on and Esther's as a kind of personal account of what's going on. Bleak House is one of my favourite Dickens novels. I am very fond of it. I think it is brilliant, and one of the things I do love about it is the dual narrative structure and how that kind of creates a very different reading experience from some of his other books. I also want to quickly mention the Bartimaeus Trilogy by Jonathan Stroud. This is the first one. I have spoken about this series before. They're a series I really enjoy. They're kind of YA, middle grade. I don't really know where they really fall, but they're about this alternate version of Britain and the world that's kind of ruled by magicians, and the magicians rely on demons to kind of give them the power they have. And the series are all told half from the first person perspective of a demon called Bartimaeus and half in third person. And in the first book, the third person just focuses on one young boy called Nathaniel, and then in the second and the third book there's also another character who becomes increasingly important called Kitty, and she is also viewed from the third person. I really love how like the 2 different narrative perspectives running alongside each other gives you a kind of different perspective on the world. So Bartimaeus is very funny. He is witty and sarcastic sarcastic and cynical about everything. He doesn't always have much time for humanity, which is always very entertaining. He also uses footnotes for added explanation and kind of more detail about the world, which I really enjoy. It really works for the whole series because Bartimaeus is very funny and his chapters are often very light, but Nathaniel takes himself incredibly seriously, a lot more seriously than Bartimaeus takes him, which proves for some very entertaining reading. Unlike Bleak House and unlike most of the other books we're about to talk about, you do see Nathaniel from Bartimaeus' perspective and Bartimaeus from Nathaniel's perspective. I do really enjoy this series, and I think to read everything in Bartimaeus' voice might become a bit irritating, or it wouldn't be quite as effective, or you wouldn't be able to kind of access certain elements of the plot, but because we have that really entertaining first-person voice and then a kind of more detached third-person perspective, I think that's really, really effective. And I also wanted to talk about this amazing book, which is A Tale for the Time Being by Ruth Ozeki. So half of this book is told from the perspective of a schoolgirl called Now. She has spent most of her life living in America and then moves with her parents back to Japan. Her parents are originally from Japan, and everything is kind of going terribly wrong for her family. She is atrociously bullied in school, and I mean like properly atrociously bullied, and her dad is very depressed and they're really struggling for money, and she's writing this kind of diary, this account of her life, but she's also writing about the life of her great-grandmother, who is a Buddhist nun. And then the other half of this book is about a woman called Ruth in North America, and walking along the shore one day, Ruth finds this diary in a sealed plastic bag that has washed up on the beach, and that diary is Now's. So she is reading Now's diary and also kind of editing it, so occasionally in Now's diary we get like footnotes which explain things, and so we're both reading Now's story, but we're also reading Ruth reading Now's story, and there's a lot of discussion between Ruth and her partner Oliver about the book that they are both reading and like how they feel they are affected by it. And the way Now writes her side of the narrative is like she's talking to someone. She's writing this diary for someone because she doesn't really have many people in her life that she can talk to. On the one hand, she is talking directly to Ruth in a way, but then she's also talking directly to us in a way, and it's just a very clever, like, layered narrative. And I also really, really want to talk about If Nobody Speaks of Remarkable Things by John McGregor. This is one of my favourite books of all time. I read it in 2014 at the recommendation of one of my MA tutors, and I was just utterly blown away. It is, of course, a dual narrative, part third person, part first person. So the third person narration going through this is an objective observer watching the activities of all the residents of one street on just one day. And then the first person perspective is one of the young women that lived on that street when she was a student, looking back on that day, but also like living her life. And as with A Tale for the Time Being, it kind of goes in alternate chapters. And basically what you find out very early on is that something happened on this day that is important, that has really, really seriously affected this young woman. And you know when you're reading the story of that one day that something dreadful and something important is going to happen, but you don't know what it is. You just know something significant is going to shake this woman and everyone else living on that street. And it makes for the most compelling reading because you have this retrospective narrative told from this young woman at the same time as you have this narrative going on like in the moment. And having that dual structure throughout kind of means you're building up to this big event, both forwards and backwards, and it's just really clever and brilliant, and I love this book so much. It is beautiful and incredible, and so many more people need to read this. I cannot recommend this book enough. And I also want to mention How to Be Both by Ali Smith. The form of this book is very different from the other ones I've mentioned so far, in that rather than the first person and the third person narrative perspectives kind of weaving in and out of each other, in this one they're just one after each other. So in my copy, the first half of this book is all in the third person about this young woman called George in the present day, and the second half of the book is all in first person about a Renaissance painter. And I said in my copy because depending on what copy you buy of this book, they might be the other way round, which I think is really cool and really affects your reading experience, I think. Like, I don't know if you watch One Book, One Review, I'll link her channel down below, it's really good, but she did a review of How to Be Both, and she said that she read the part from the perspective of the Renaissance painter first, and that she actually much preferred that part and found it harder to get into George's narrative. Whereas for me, I read George's first and then the Renaissance painter, and it took me much longer to get into the Renaissance painter, and I preferred George's narrative overall. So I think the way round you read this can really affect the perspective you have on it, which I think is really clever and really interesting. I also really like the fact that the two sections of the narrative are tied together both by kind of the Renaissance painter watching George, but also by like the themes they share, and although it is a book of two halves, it is still very much a coherent whole, and it still is a novel that really works as one, and I just think it's a great book. And finally, I want to talk about What a Carver by Jonathan Cove. This is another one of my favourite modern novels of all time. I think it is an incredible, incredible book, a really weird book, such a strange book, but so clever, and I studied this at university, which was wonderful because it's very odd and it has a very odd structure. It took me a while to decide whether or not to include this in this video because half of the book is a dual narrative. Like the first 2/3, I would say, of the book is a dual narrative, half first person, half third person, and then the last section of the book does something slightly different. So the first person narrator in this book, who occupies about half of the narrative in the first half of the novel, his name is Michael, and he is a man who is kind of going through a lot of problems in his life. His narrative begins with him having like a sort of 2-minute conversation with his next door neighbour, at the end of which he tells her that it's the longest conversation he's had in about 2 years. He has kind of retreated from the world, and the thing that he spends most of his life doing is obsessively rewatching a clip from this old horror film called What a Carver, which he loves, and also writing this biography. And this biography he is writing is a biography of this family called the Winshaw family. And the Winshaw family are this incredibly all-powerful, very rich, very greedy, very utterly evil family. And so the third person narration that kind of weaves in and out of Michael's story is a third-person reflection on the Winshaw family. But we're never completely certain whether the third-person account we have of the Winshaw family is supposed to be the book Michael is writing, or whether it is just an objective third-person account, and there is no way of knowing, which is something I really like about the book. And so, at the same time as we're getting the story of the Winshaw family sort of one by one of these 5 awful siblings, we're also getting Michael's story of researching the Winshaw family and of his relationship with his next door neighbour and kind of everything else that's going on in his life. And that's kind of a fairly straightforward dual narrative, and that is the first half of the book. And then the second half of the book gets really odd, because suddenly all the characters, all the cast from the rest of the book turn up in the same Winshaw mansion at the same time, and we get this third-person account of this one night that becomes a sort of pastiche on a horror film and a sort of real-life game of Cluedo. It's really weird, but it's so good. Like, this is a strange book. I don't think this is going to appeal to everyone. This is definitely a postmodernist novel. The form really works to carry across this particular story, because it doesn't feel realistic, but it's not supposed to be, because it's kind of a parable and a satire, and even if it's not always completely realistic, you're still very emotionally engaged with it. It's just a brilliant, brilliant book, and the structure is so clever and so wonderful and just thoroughly, thoroughly brilliant. So anyway, I think those are all the books I wanted to talk about today. I hope you have enjoyed this episode of Non-Linear Books. Please let me know in the comments if you have any particular favourite books that make use both of third person and first person at the same time. So please let me know if you have any recommendations, and as always, please let me know if you have read any of these books and what you thought of them. Also, just before I go, don't forget my Q&A is still open. If you want to ask me any questions from my Q&A, you can do so in the comments down below or elsewhere. I'll be back on Thursday with another video, and in the meantime, happy reading.